Nachdenkseiten.
Hello, I'm Michael Holmes. Today, it's my great pleasure to talk to Pankaj Mishra, one of the leading cosmopolitan intellectuals from India today. Unfortunately, we can't use the camera because there's a terrible heat wave, and yeah, we are worried that the computers may break down and everything because it's like super hot. So we're doing it without the camera, and we also have to keep it short. Pankaj, you are a novelist, an essayist, a nonfiction author. You have written for The Guardian, The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books. You are the author of From the Ruins of Empire, Age of Anger, and today we want to talk about your latest book, The World After Gaza. All the books I just mentioned are also out in German. Die Welt nach Gaza. This book is a fascinating look at the global debate, the global battle over the historical narratives around Israel and Palestine. It's an it's an investigation on the question that's why are so many millions of people around the world drawn into the conflict, so interested in the conflict over Israel and Palestine on both sides of the conflict. Why so many people in the West support Israel and why so many people in the global South, in Asia, the Middle East, of course, Africa, and Latin America sympathize with the Palestinians. Pankaj, welcome to Nachdenkseiten.
Thank you, Michael.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your personal story? How did you get to write about Israel and Palestine, and how did you get to write this book?
Well, I have written about this subject before, many years ago, and it's a subject that I've been engaging with. I suppose from the very beginning of my sort of consciousness, adult consciousness, and even as a child, I was engaging with it in the sense that one of my earliest heroes was Moshe Dayan. I write about this in my book.
Mhm.
Uh, a lot of people in India who belong to upper caste sort of families were very much infatuated by the state of Israel because they saw in the state of Israel an admirable model for Hindu nationalists. Israel was
Mhm.
admirable because it was just ruthlessly brutal with its enemies, with its minorities. And we in India thought that our own government was extremely weak and not simply not tough enough, especially with its Muslim population. So
Mhm.
that became one reason why Zionism, in particular, in Israel, became so important for many of us because they were seen as completely brutal and uncompromising in their attitudes towards their enemies. Today, of course, you have many more people in India who feel the same way as we did back in the 1970s when I was a child. We back then belonged to a tiny minority. There are many more people who are who feel that way about. Um, so I think that's the sort of beginning of this engagement with the subject. Of course, when I grew up, um, I encountered many different ways in which this subject opens up. You meet Palestinian students, as I did in
Mhm.
Indian universities, Indian colleges, and they told you a very different story altogether
Mhm.
about Israel and how Israel came into existence. These were obviously students who were children of people who had been driven out of Palestine in 1948 and afterwards, who were living in places like Jordan and Syria and Kuwait. And then, of course, started to read in history, in Middle Eastern history, in also the history of Europe. And so gradually, my knowledge about this subject expanded. I came to have a much more complex vision of this particular history. But, nothing really prepared me for what I saw when I actually went to Israel in 2008,
Mm-hmm.
when I actually encountered the occupation of the West Bank. I never went to Gaza,
Mm-hmm.
so I wasn't able to see how things were there. But the occupation of West Bank was shocking enough for me, and I'll tell you why it was shocking. It was shocking, obviously, for all the reasons it is shocking for anyone who goes there. The very kind of explicit system of discrimination, of segregation, what many people call correctly, I think, apartheid. People like Desmond Tutu have called it apartheid, and he should know since he lived under an apartheid regime.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think it's especially shocking if you come from a place like India, because the foundational narrative about India is that this is a country that won its independence from white supremacist European imperialists who were extremely brutal and cruel and exploitative.
Mm-hmm.
And Indians waged a very long battle to get rid of these colonialists and imperialists. And likewise, many countries in Asia and Africa did the same. And with this kind of battle, which was won in the 1940s, after decades and decades, with this kind of battle, we entered a new phase of history in which decolonization or the emergence of countries like India and China created a new situation altogether, where people who were not white skinned, people who did not come from Europe, would be treated with freedom and dignity, would have a sort of a place in the world that will no longer be defined by white supremacists. So that's the narrative you grow up with in India and many other places, in fact, all of Asia and Africa. But
Mm-hmm.
then you go to Palestine, you go to the occupied territories, and you see colonialist states fully backed by all the major Western powers and the United States, including the United States, of course, basically enforcing ruthlessly a regime that, for you at least, for anyone from India, should have disappeared a long time ago.
Mm. Right.
So as I say, it's a different kind of shock you experience. It's like, as people have described it, Ta-Nehisi Coates described it as, suddenly discovering that Jim Crow still exists, and that arriving at some place in the American South and realizing there's still segregation going on, just when you thought, things we have moved forward from all that. So that's what Israel represents. That's what Israel represents, a very cruel anachronism in the eyes of the world,
Mm-hmm.
outside of Western Europe and the United States. German and Austrian journalists, over the last few weeks and months,
Mm-hmm.
and one question they always ask is, how come you're so interested in this subject? And the assumption behind this question is that this is really a subject that should concern, either Palestinians or Arabs on one side,
Mm-hmm.
or it should concern, Europeans or Germans in particular,
Mm-hmm.
because of what happened in Europe, and the reason why Israel came into existence and why Germany supports Israel. These are the reasons why Germans should be interested in all this, and there's really no reason for someone from India to be interested in this. And I have to tell them, explain to them very patiently, I hope, that this is a question, this is a subject that goes to the heart of what we believe in, what we think is our place in the wider world, what
Mhm.
we think has happened in the world over the last 150, 200 years. In other words, it cuts right to the heart of our deepest identity.
Right.
Um, and the reason you ask this question is because you are extremely poorly educated about the rest of the world. You have no idea about
Right.
how people in China or India perceive themselves, perceive their history, perceive global history, that you have lived for too long in an extremely solipsistic world, and that you need to break out of those worlds and to really experience the world or modern history in the way a vast majority of the world's population experiences it. I hope I'm not too harsh when I say these things. I try to say them very gently,
Yeah.
but I'm really surprised by the profound ignorance amongst extremely well-educated people about how billions and billions of people see themselves and see their place in the world.
No, I think most people in the West are simply not aware that almost the people of almost any country in the global South have had similar experiences with Western, so-called Western liberal democracies in the past, colonizing them, overthrowing governments, and things like that. And also today with climate change, we're having a big heat wave now. Whose responsibility is that? So that's why they sympathize with the Palestinians naturally, because they feel like, oh, it's like with us, and it just, and I think what you show in the book is that they feel confirmed. They feel confirmed that the West hasn't changed as much as they pretend to, that it's still the old West who wants to rule over the world, and they're even willing to commit genocide to rule over the rest and come with hypocritical talk about, democracy and human rights and all that.
That even great violence unleashed by the West is ultimately for a noble cause, the cause
Mhm.
of modernity, the cause of democracy, the cause of freedom. This rhetoric has been heard since the 19th century. This is another thing your readers or your listeners should understand, that if people have been extremely cynical about this kind of rhetoric, about Western leadership, about Western moral leadership, and sort of the Western rules-based international order, if these concepts are met with cynicism, even laughter in large parts of the world, because too many people around the world have been accustomed to this kind of mendacious and hypocritical rhetoric for a very long time. And of course, the Cold War, when this rhetoric really became resonant again after a short gap, you will remember that Europe destroyed itself in two civil wars in the first half of the 20th century. And I've
Mhm.
written about this in other books, and how Asian and African leaders, thinkers, writers took note of those civil wars and realized that Europe had absolutely no claim to any kind of moral leadership if it could indulge in such grotesque atrocities of the kind that were witnessed during those two world wars. But then soon after 1945, the West made another claim on moral leadership, which is that we are opposed to Soviet communism and we represent democracy, we represent freedom. But during the Cold War, obviously that rhetoric was exported to large parts of the world. And again, there was a lot of cynicism about that. And we saw that that the Western powers themselves violating their stated principles in places like Iran, where a democratically elected prime minister was deposed in the 50s. And then, of course, we saw in Vietnam. There's so many examples in Latin America of
Mhm.
democratically elected leaders, Chile most notoriously, being overthrown or being killed or being deposed with the help of the CIA, with the help of British intelligence agencies. So this rhetoric really hasn't persuaded too many people for a long time. Today, of course, when major Western powers are supporting arming a genocide, I think I would say at this point, there are very few people left around the world who still believe that the West acts in a way that can be even remotely called moral at this point. That this is an entity that is entirely invested in maintaining its dominance over the world, in maintaining its unequal share of the world's resources. And if it requires extreme violence, if it requires genocide to maintain that domination, they will not hesitate to go that far. That is what the last few months have revealed to the global majority. So I think, again, these facts are largely unknown to people in Germany and Austria. So I'm sort of emphasizing them for their benefit.
Yeah, and I have to say the chapter of the in the book about Germany is really good, and it's worth reading when you're German, because you're holding up a mirror from us as only outsiders can do sometimes, and I learned from it, and I'm a German left-wing intellectual, so it's really good. Can you make a basic outline what you're saying about why does Germany support Israel with weapons and diplomacy, basically propaganda, and why is it doing that? What does it tell us about Germany's history and Germany today?
Regarded with the same distrust, hostility, or contempt that France or Britain or the United States is regarded with
Mm,
in large parts of the world. And why is that? Because Germany was never really a very large imperialist presence in the lives of Asians and Africans. Sure, they had, small colonies here and there in Asia and Africa, but they were too small, they were too short-lived. And even though, there were some horrific atrocities, particularly in Africa, the cultural memory or the national memory of these atrocities was really quite confined. It was relatively insignificant. And so I thought, Germany actually could be this new Western interlocutor for many countries of Asia and Africa, particularly when we need globally coordinated responses to challenges like climate change or artificial intelligence. And with the United States going the way it's going, we need a responsible Western interlocutor, and thought Germany was in a position to play that role. But I think my own assessment of all this depended on an assumption which I know was false, which I shared a lot with a lot of with a lot of other people. And that assumption was that Germany, in addition to not being a very strong imperialist presence in Asia and Africa, had actually reckoned with its imperialist past in Europe, and
mhm,
that Germany had really, in a way, confronted squarely the extraordinary crimes it inflicted on not just the Jewish population, but also on various other European communities. And that this is a country unlike any other in the West that had the courage, that had the moral courage to do all that. Of course, like people who have written books about this, such as Susan Neiman, um, I realize that that was really a false assumption, that Germany has done nothing of that kind.
mhm,
And why was that? Because I think when we see today that in less than a century, Germany has been, first of all, directly, uh, it was the direct perpetrator of a genocide, the biggest in human history.
right.
That was in the 20th century. And now it's complicit in the 21st century's biggest and most monstrous genocide.
Wow.
So
Yeah. What a
I
way of putting
think
it.
if a nation state, if a political culture, an intellectual culture is complicit in such monstrous acts of violence in less than a century, then we have to ask a very different set of questions about that country. We can't see it as normal anymore. We
Mm,
can't see this as a normal nation state that went wrong somewhere. I think we are looking at some very serious pathologies here. What are those pathologies? Can we identify them? Can we diagnose them? This is increasingly, I suspect, going to be an urgent question for many of us as we go forward,
mhm,
and especially as the far right surges in Germany and Austria, especially as Germany remilitarizes, opening up again a whole set of very dangerous sort of questions. Um, and I think, I really had to start thinking very rapidly about these issues when it became clear that the German political class and media class were enthusiastically supporting the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians. And there was something profoundly, profoundly pathological and sinister about this. I had to quickly abandon my previous assumptions and ideas about Germany and to embark on a rapid self education, start reading a whole lot of books that I had not paid attention to before, such as the connection between Germany and the state of Israel. Start reading books about philo-Semitism. Just what does that explain? Why did
mm,
philo-Semitism become such an important social phenomena in Germany after the war? And some of those, some of the fruits of those readings are there in my book. So it's not a original account in any ways, in any way of German pathologies. These are subjects that a whole lot of people have been writing about, whether it's Peter Gay, whether it's Frank Stern, whether most recently is Daniel Marvecki, who wrote a whole book about the diplomatic relations between Germany and Israel, which is really an eye-opening book in many ways.
mm.
And I think, some of the things you discover, the way in which Germans, powerful Germans in particular, and when I say Germans here, I really mean people in the political class and the media class. I
Right.
think, ordinary Germans, it's very clear in one opinion poll after another, they very strongly disapprove of what Israel is doing. They
Right.
have views and opinions that are actually not at all reflected by the politicians, by the journalists.
True.
But there are very powerful, influential people in Germany who have a very strong sense of identification with Israel, and these are people not only on the lunatic right. These are not only people who
No.
run tabloids, who own tabloids, but also people writing for places like Die Zeit, for supposedly
Exactly.
respectable mainstream newspapers. I
It's
think
the
it's
it's the
a
it's the center. It's the center in Germany supporting genocide and parts of the left too. It's quite shocking.
yes, it's
Yeah.
the Green Party. I
Right.
mean, this is a Green Party
Yeah.
founded by someone who was an admirer of Mahatma Gandhi, and
Right.
this is a Green Party now wholly invested in militarism, wholly supportive of Israel's genocide. So what I'm trying to say is that this is something that requires now a different kind of intellectual effort. I think it's no longer enough to quote Habermas. I think Habermas himself is part of a pathology now. I think that's something we have to examine, given his
Yeah.
responses to the genocide. Um, and we need to now look at Germany in the way Adorno and Hannah Arendt looked at Germany after 1945.
Ooh,
What
that's now
is
it's really harsh what you're saying, but
what
yeah.
is no what is going on here? What is
Mhm.
going on here? And I've spoken only of the support for the genocide. I've not spoken of the brutal crackdown on dissenters, people expressing,
Mhm.
and these include some of the most prominent Jewish writers and thinkers in the world. The German crackdown on them, which seems to indicate that only Germans or only German politicians and German journalists have the right to speak about what kind of lessons should be learned from the Holocaust. Even Jewish people don't have the right to do that. That's really
Right.
truly extraordinary and presumptuous and arrogant, beyond
Right.
belief, beyond belief. Um, but that's
Yes.
the lesson you can see when someone like Masha Gessen is shut down, when she's cancelled. There are any number of examples I can come up with.
Yeah.
But no, I think, I mean, I'm not being extreme here. I do think there's something profoundly, disturbingly wrong about German political culture and media
Yeah.
culture right now. And we need, I will repeat this, we need a determined effort to diagnose this before it becomes not only Germany's problem, but a European problem and perhaps a world problem.
Yes. I want to ask you really quickly because 5 years ago I visited Kashmir, and I was like, first of all, it was the most beautiful place I've ever been to, with the mountains and the lake, and it's a beautiful place. But I was shocked by the place is completely occupied by Indian troops. You see them everywhere. They're always like looking into people, and you feel observed all the time. I was really shocked, and I've been all around the world in many conflict zones. Can you just say a few quick words about the occupation of Kashmir and the conflict with between India and Pakistan?
Yeah, absolutely. Kashmir was really actually the first subject that I wrote about at great length. This is in 1999. I went there more than 25 years ago.
Mm,
And in those days, there was hardly any discussion of Kashmir in the Indian press or in the world press, for that matter. It
mm,
was, seen as some sort of obscure conflict between India and Pakistan. And again, I used to think of it, as something that was really happening very far away, even though I was living in India. And it's only after I visited the place and talked to Kashmiris, talked to the Indian officials who were supervising the military occupation of the valley, that I came to actually understand the subject in all its gory detail and realized that this was really a case of one of the most, horrifically brutal military occupations in the world. And the kind of things that were happening there on a daily basis, murders, torture, rape, and very little of it actually reported. Very little of it, certainly hardly any stories in the Indian press, and occasionally there would be a story here and there in the international press. Um, I think that was the first indication to me, Michael, that post-colonial countries that had come into existence with a whole lot of virtuous claims, and the virtuous claims were, okay, here we are, we won this remarkable, very hard won victory over Western imperialists. This is
mhm,
now an opportunity to create a new political order which will be defined by dignity and freedom for all, which will be defined by social and economic equality. This is, something that India or the leaders of India said when they started out fighting the British, and then, of course, they reiterated those promises when India became independent. And I, as a young man growing up, uh, obviously embraced that narrative, just as I embraced the narrative about defeating Western imperialism. But when I went to Kashmir, I realized that nation states, once they come into existence, are very likely to become exploitative and cruel in the same way that Western imperialists were once
Mm-hmm.
brutal and exploitative. And there is certain logic to the way a nation state operates, in the way it exercises sovereignty, in the way it imposes its writ upon different parts of the population. So Kashmir, I think, to answer your question, was for me a very instructive lesson. One that I also took to Israel when I went there, because by the time
Mm-hmm.
I went to Israel, I was prepared to see that even when a state comes into existence with a whole lot of claims to virtue, it can very quickly turn exploitative and cruel, and that the claims to virtue won't certainly won't prevent you from becoming cruel and exploitative. They might serve as a cloak or as a mask for you.
Mm-hmm.
So, India claims to be a secular democracy, yet it is brutally exploitative in Kashmir.
Mm-hmm.
Israel claims to be or claims to possess the most moral army in the world, to be the most moral nation state in the world, founded as a refuge for the survivors of the Holocaust. Today, it's complicit in a Holocaust. Now, it may surprise people who think that victims are perpetually innocent, no matter how many generations pass. But I think there is a logic to the nation state that makes even the most virtuous people turn into oppressors.
Mm-hmm.
Even the most pathetic victims turn into powerful oppressors. And that's a logic we must identify. To come back to your earlier question, I think one of the real problems, cognitive and moral problems with the German vision of Israel is that they cannot see how Israel has transformed itself over the decades, how it is no
Mm-hmm.
longer the virtuous state that came into existence, that was dreamed of by people horribly persecuted in Europe, um,
Mm-hmm.
victims of anti Semitism. They cannot see that the same people over several decades can turn into oppressors. And
Mm-hmm.
something that has happened in India can also happen in Israel. It can happen, it has happened in several nation states across Asia and Africa. So when people say, "Why are you focusing on Israel?" I said, "Actually, no, I'm not focusing on Israel at all. I've started my career writing about India,
Right.
and I've written about China. I've written about Indonesia. All these problems that nation states have. Um, it's you who think that Israel is exceptional. I don't think Israel is exceptional at all.
Mm-hmm.
So many of these nation states came into existence primarily as nations of victims and then turned into oppressors. So again, I mean, I think, to answer your question, like Kashmir was my first, in a way, lesson in in this particular way.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I have to point out that the book is not at all like an anti-Western tirade. And it also has so much sympathy. It tells the story of Jewish suffering since the pogroms culminating in the Holocaust. But you also dispel a lot of myths about the Holocaust. For example, you point out that the concentration camps were not liberated by Western troops, but by the Soviet army, which did most of the fighting against Nazi Germany. So this is also like another part of the myths in the West about like the founding myths about how we defeated like Nazi Germany and then later the communist threat and so on. It's I think you're just asking for more nuance and also to try to see things also from the perspective of people in the global South. You're not saying, no, the Holocaust is not that important. It is, and you earlier called it the largest and also like the worst genocide in history. But there are so many other mass atrocities, and so many of them committed by Western democracies, and by Britain and France all over the global South, by the United States during the Cold War and before and after, and so it's just. I think the book is also just to play that you can kill innocent people in the name of any ideology, whether it's like democracy and liberalism, or it can be communism or nationalism, anti-imperialism, whatever your main narrative is. If you are too fanatically sticking to it, you may just justify horrible crimes and you may not even notice
I
it.
think that's right. I mean, I think, this may be a somewhat arcane point, but essentially, any ideology that depends on its fulfillment in time, um, that sort of offers a kind of transcendence in the world as it is very likely to be violent. In the past,
Mm,
human beings thought of transcendence as something that happens beyond time, that happens in the afterlife, and it's connected to the afterlife. But
mm,
with the modern world, with the ideologies of nationalism, with the ideologies of revolution, with the ideologies of capitalism, we enter a different phase altogether when you think you can recreate some kind of a perfect society or state in this world, and that kind of effort would always require a degree of violence and coercion. um, I mean, I think, to add to your point, I'm stereotypically seen in large parts of the West as someone who's speaking on behalf of
mhm,
India or the global South, or who's kind
mhm,
of bringing in, some sort of anti-Western perspective. Um,
mhm.
that is not at all what I'm doing. As I
Yeah.
said, the first critiques, the first even pieces of political journalism I did were all about Asia. It was a mode of self-criticism. Uh,
Mhm,
it's because I found that there was very little conversation in England or America about imperialism. When I arrived in UK in the late 90s,
mhm,
British imperialism was still being upheld as a great achievement by
mhm,
not some fringe far right people. You could watch a documentary on BBC saying the
mhm.
British Empire helped promote free trade and democracy around the world. So a complete
Yeah.
lie was being fed to the British population. So it's in that context, for someone like myself, could not but intervene and say, people who are saying this are really lying to you. They're really completely deceiving you. So when you say these things, you get typecast as a anti-Western person. But I
Mhm,
think, this is the context in which you're forced to operate, in large parts of Western Europe and America. And today it's much worse, actually, in many ways. If you say these things, you're denounced as woke and, delegitimized. So it's these are subjects that call for frank and honest discussion, where we must really break free of our inherited identities, our inherited narratives, and really have only one commitment, which is to justice and dignity and equality for all. If you don't believe that, then of course, you're going to be lying to yourself, and you're going to be lying to other people.
mhm. Yeah, I think what you also show in the book, what plays a big role here, is both the divide between the rich and the poor countries, because you tell the story when you went to Palestine and Israel, you were shocked by the difference in like how Israelis have a beautiful life, just like in the West, and with swimming pools and everything, and the Palestinians are just suffering horribly, not just from violence and discrimination, but also just from horrible poverty, and this divide is so stark. So I think that dimension, like an economically dimension, is also so important, that many people in the global South still believe that, you know, their poverty is to a large degree like the product also of an unfair global system that has been unfair for the last 300 years, you know. And people in the West just see it as a meritocratic global order where they deserve to be rich because we're so hardworking and so democratic and so beautiful, you know.
Yeah, I think, the reluctance to discuss Western imperialism or slavery actually is related to this belief that many people have that the West is powerful or West is dominant because of some innate Western advantages of superior intelligence, a scientific industrial revolution, a lot of things that the West did, which other people were unable to do. There's a lot
Hmm.
of truth in this claim that the West pioneered, innovated in certain areas
Sure.
ahead of Asia and Africa. But on the whole, the great imbalances and inequalities that we see today in the world are a direct result of Western imperialism. The fact that so great a part of the world was brought under Western rule, and that the great wealth of countries like India and China was systematically looted and centered and stored in places like Britain and Europe and America. So I think these are facts that need to be suppressed because how else can you sustain the narrative that
Hmm.
credits some unique Western genius for Western dominance? But that again, I think that doesn't fool anyone um, except people or some people in the West, because everyone else knows what happened in places like India or Indonesia, that these were at one time extremely rich and powerful societies, but they were systematically subjugated and then systematically exploited. Those stories are too well known, and no matter how many documentaries the BBC puts out there, that basic information is not going to be obscured.
In the global south, of course, the Holocaust plays a less central role. One simple reason being that's a different world region. It's like, why should people in Africa care so much what happened in Europe, right? Um, but you admit that it's sort of often downplayed, sometimes even denied, the Holocaust. But you also show that people in the global south, when they talk about the Holocaust, they see it as another example of Western imperialism, Western colonialism, and you show that they absolutely have a point because the Nazi regime, and that's also forgotten. Like Hitler and many Nazis admired the British Empire and what they did to India. They admired what the Americans did to the native people there, the genocide against Native Americans in the U.S. and in Australia and other places. And the idea was to make Lebensraum, to have a colonial system and slavery in the East over like basically Eastern Europe and Russia.
No, Michael, my effort in all the books I've written really is to open up, global history.
Hmm.
So get away from parochial provincial narratives about nation states or about continents or about, the West or Asia and Africa, but to look
Hmm.
at the main operations of global history since the 19th century. And in this process, I constantly come up against people who will say, "Oh, but how does this connect?" Or the question I raised earlier, like, how come you are so interested in the Holocaust or
Hmm.
in these subjects? And I want to say, how can we be not interested in these subjects because
Hmm.
they concern us all? I think when uh, Hitler was making his intentions known in the 1930s, the people who could see right away that Hitler had set out to very consciously emulate British imperialists, Those
Mhm.
people were there in Asia and Africa already, long before Hannah Arendt made that connection in The Origins of Totalitarianism. People like Nehru, M.S. Césaire, they were already saying that Nazism is the twin brother of British and French imperialism, that it is seeking to do in Europe what British and other Western imperialists have done in Asia and Africa, because there isn't enough space left. There isn't much Lebensraum left in Asia and Africa. So a frustrated empire is now seeking territory and resources in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So this insight, this vision was already established in the 1930s, and I
Mhm.
think that vision has, over the years, only been kind of further entrenched in large parts of the world. In the West, of course, this is blasphemy to most people who think that Western democracies waged a great war against Nazi totalitarianism, and there is absolutely no way you can compare the two. But I think the one thing that is common, that's shared between Western democracies and Nazi totalitarianism, is the fact of imperialism, is this desire, this imperative to expand, to steal other people's land, to steal other people's territories, to create racial hierarchies. All of this was common to most of them. So the rest of us cannot not see those connections. We have to see those connections. As I said, they were seeing those connections right from the very beginning. And for that very reason, the Holocaust is not something totally unprecedented. The Holocaust is unprecedented in some ways, but it is not unprecedented in the sense that there were a lot of genocides in many different parts of the world, millions and millions of people dying as a consequence of conscious policy making by Western imperialists. A lot of, you know, just extraordinary violence was inflicted on native peoples, whether in the Congo or in Ireland, just around the world, not to mention genocides of indigenous peoples and so on. So uh, I think the Western powers or Western societies have very uh, carefully suppressed aspects of their imperialist past, of their violent past. They look at the Holocaust as a case of Western moral supremacy. We finally took on this Nazi evil regime. We liberated the camps. But of course, when you examine those narratives, they fall apart very quickly. You know that they did not actually liberate the death camps. I mean, to give you a very small example, that
Mhm.
they were not really truly democracies for the hundreds of millions of people they ruled elsewhere. Um, they were
Right.
they were built upon horribly cruel racial hierarchies. They were very far from being democracies. But this is of course propaganda that, as I said, some of the most well-educated people now believe in, have internalized. So I think we cannot really understand global history, in other words, if we stay trapped in these silos
Mhm.
of national history or continental history, or if we believe too much in these self-congratulatory, self-flattering narratives about how we embody uh, political, geopolitical virtue, and everyone else is horribly tainted and corrupt.
Yeah, there's a great example for what you're talking about in the book, which is not in the book, is when I went to visit Belfast, Northern Ireland. I was like astonished and also amused that there are all these streets, among the peace walls, like where on one side there was like all these Palestinian flags on the Irish Republican side, of course, and on the loyalist pro-British side there was like all these Israeli flags, like it's full of it. Like Northern Ireland has so many Israeli and Palestinian flags. So it's another example of what you're talking about in the book, that Irish Republicans have like this history and this memory of being oppressed by this Western democracy, Britain, and they know what it's like when you're colonized, and then later when you like, you're occupied and it's not seen, and also in the name of democracy. And, on the loyalist side, of course, identifies with Britain and so on.
I mean,
So,
you mentioned Ireland. It's also worth asking, why did South Africa, which is such a, so much poorer than Ireland,
mhm,
so dependent in many ways on Europe and the United States.
mhm,
Uh, why did South Africa take such a potentially risky step
right,
in going to court against Israel at the
right,
ICJ?
yeah,
Nelson Mandela said, the freedom of South Africans is not free without the freedom of Palestinians. Now, people quote that
mhm,
statement. They don't realize that similar statements were made by Nehru, any number of Sukarno, any number of post-colonial leaders,
right,
uh, that this freedom is not secure until it's secured for all of us. So, with people of actual experience of apartheid. Also, for regime, you have to remember Nelson Mandela, all that, they were up against a regime that had very close relations with the state of Israel, even though it was an
right,
apartheid regime. South Africa was being armed and had all kinds of very dodgy relationships with the state of Israel. So there's a history there we must try and understand if we want to know why South Africa took that risky step and
mhm,
is being punished for that right now.
right.
And it's like you need to ask the right questions about these issues, because these are people with personal painful experience of horrible violent racism, and so they will not put up with what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. They will speak out and risk being ostracized by Western power, but they are willing to take that risk.
Right. You also show in the book it's not just about colonialism, it's also much later during the Cold War. In the case of South Africa, the United States supported the apartheid regime, so did Britain, so did West Germany, and so, of course, did Israel, very importantly. So it is also about the alliances during the Cold War when the West often supported colonial regimes. You show that, you mentioned that West Germany supported Portugal's very brutal colonial campaigns in Angola and Mozambique. So yeah, it's
Well,
also
this I
about.
mean, I think West Germany's record during the Cold War is really incredibly sordid. I
Mhm,
mean, it's only while researching this book or thinking about this book that I came across evidence of that. But I was really shocked to see the extent to which West Germany supported some of the most disreputable regimes around the world, and how they tried to keep alive neo-colonialist projects of Portugal, for instance, in Africa.
mhm.
I mean, again, I think it was part of my kind of reassessment of Germany's role in the wider world and its increasing political kind of craziness at this point.
Yeah, you also show in the book that, well, which is uncontroversial, but you show that the global south is rising, of course, and you criticize this view to only see this as an economic phenomenon. The GDP of China is growing and growing, growing, and Vietnam and so on. You say like, no, no, it's much more. It is that much of the global south, especially East Asia, of course, but not only, is rising, growing more powerful. They have more intellectuals like you, and you are starting to speak up and you are gaining confidence and power. And the West seems to still not realize that. So that makes like this moral failure over Gaza also like an own goal. I mean, I think that most Germans, for example, and also most Americans don't realize how big of a problem that is, that this rising, you know, every day growing in power global south, China and many of its allies in countries like South Africa and Brazil and Mexico and India, of course, and Indonesia, that they are not going to take this anymore. And now the
Yeah,
lecturing is over. No more lectures on this, not from the West.
Yeah, I think we've gone way beyond the lecturing phrase. I mean, I think, when the German chancellor says openly that Israel is doing the dirty work for all of us,
Hmm.
meaning Western powers, how do you think that statement is received in a
He said
country
that
like
about Iran.
China? Yes, about the Israeli attack on Iran,
Right,
which is a close ally of China, and they have a very strong economic relationship.
right.
Um, Now, when the German chancellor, who's obviously profoundly ignorant about history, about I don't think he's a great reader. For instance, someone told me that somebody gave him a
No.
novel to read, the famous novel, the Leopard, and he said, "What is this for? Why should I read this?" But anyway, let's not focus on him. I'm just saying,
Mhm.
when he says something like this, obviously, people in China and Beijing who are listening to this um, know that what we are looking at here is a proxy power of people who are determined to maintain Western domination over the world. And
Mhm.
that they certainly are in no position to issue any lectures if they are supporting a country that is openly committing genocide, that is engaging in warfare against several nation states simultaneously, not just Iran, by the way,
Mhm.
also against Syria, stealing Syrian land, against Lebanon, um, while at the same time building settlements in West Bank, killing people there, and of course killing people uh, running for food in Gaza today. So this sort of understanding that people have built upon their own historical experience and the Chinese narrative of 100 years of humiliation by Western powers, one can only very easily imagine, I think, you can very easily imagine how they would treat a statement like that from the German chancellor as
Mhm.
irrefutable evidence that these Western leaders are determined to hold on to their illegitimate power, and that there can really be no proper conversation with them, and that we also have to invest in force if we're going to have to deal with this kind of brutality. So, I mean, I think I'm trying to say that people increasingly in amongst Western political and media classes have completely lost their sense of how they are perceived in the wider world,
Yeah. Yes.
how their statements are received in the wider world, and what conclusions people are arriving at about them, and
Right.
how they have lost not only their kind of moral supremacy, but they're also really in a way now being looked at with total contempt.
Mhm.
It's not sort of indifference. Like there's a profound contempt for such people.
Mhm.
Whatever you may say about China, whatever you may say about many of these countries, they have not engaged in such atrocities. They have not gone to war over and over again in different parts of the world and reduced those places to complete ruins in the way the United States has done in one country after another, in North Africa, in the Middle East. Look at the places where the Americans have intervened. Can we
Right.
point to one country where China has intervened? I'm not at all a supporter of any country, let alone China or let alone India. But I'm just
Yeah.
saying, when you look at this from let's say Indonesia, you're trying to make a choice between who do I want to be friends with? Do I want to be friends with the United States and Germany, or do I want to be friends with China? Who's most likely to, at some point, make impossible demands on me? Well, the answer is very obvious at this point, at least. It's the United States, which won't even hesitate in claiming European territory. It won't even hesitate in claiming Canada. It won't hesitate in claiming the Panama Canal. It won't hesitate in claiming Greenland for itself. So this is the farce we are looking at here.
Yeah, I think what is so dangerous for the whole world situation that when it comes to the important, like what is so important for world peace is, of course, to the respect for national sovereignty, that you just don't invade other countries or interfere in their politics. And when it comes to this issue, as you pointed out, the West is, especially the United States, tends to be even worse than most countries in the global South. For example, China, even so, Russia is also not really very respectful of the national sovereignty of its neighbors, but most of the countries in the global south, they leave each other alone. They just have their own politics, and it's the West who constantly violates national sovereignty. And when it comes, I do believe that democracy and liberalism and secularism are very important values, and women's rights. But here the West is so hypocritical that nobody cares anymore. So I think that's a very sad situation and very dangerous situation, that like who's going to speak up for national sovereignty and peace, and who's going to speak up for democracy and secularism and gay rights without hypocrisy, without an agenda, without imperialism. It concerns me.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, I think there are still enough people around the world who don't have official positions, but
Hmm.
who belong to what might be described as the international civil society,
Hmm.
who, haven't been brought together, but they need to come together. They need to come together and create institutions and platforms where they can carry on these political struggles. It's certainly true that the old system doesn't work anymore. I've worked long enough in that system to know it cannot work anymore. I'm one of those people who would say, the Kashmiris are being oppressed, women's rights are being violated, the rights of minorities are being violated, and I would appeal to Western institutions. I've done that enough times. I know I
Hmm.
cannot do that anymore, because I would lose credibility if I did that at this point.
Why? Can you
Those
explain that?
battles, well, nobody will take me seriously in certainly, amongst the people. The Kashmiris won't take me seriously if I did that anymore.
Uh-huh.
They also exercised about Western support for the genocide in Gaza. So I think one has to
Ah, I
work
see.
differently now. Yeah, one has
Oh, you're
to
saying that
kind
you
of.
were lobbying, you were trying to get Western powers to put pressure on India to end the occupation of Kashmir, and now that's just laughable because.
I wouldn't say I was doing that directly, but I was certainly trying to create or contributing to a climate of opinion in which Western policymakers became more
Right.
aware of the sufferings of Kashmiris and recognized that as a big political problem that could lead to conflict between India and Pakistan, or something they should take an interest in. I won't be doing that anymore.
Mhm.
Um, so I think, that sense, the appeal to some kind of Western morality that can be somehow manifested through Western policymakers, that system doesn't work. So one has to look for other ways in which one can intervene. One has to work with non-governmental organizations, get out the message, get out the information in other ways.
Yeah, it's also what I also find shocking. If you think about, if most of the elites in the West can't even stop a policy when it becomes genocidal, how would we ever expect them to care about, let's say, labor rights in the supply chains for our clothes, or climate change? Like that's mostly the fault of the rich countries, and it's like mostly harming the poor. And how can we make people care about the terrible consequences for the poor of like IMF programs and things like that, you know. I mean, if they don't care about genocide, what do they care about at all? And I mean, it sounds very
I
depressing.
think
I
that's
know what I'm
people
saying.
say people ask me this question again and again.
Hmm.
So what is, you call your book The World After Gaza. Why do you
Hmm.
call it that? What is the world after Gaza? And I
Right.
say the world after Gaza is one where there are no appeals to morality anymore, where the people who claim to be the upholders of international morality
Hmm.
themselves violate those principles by engaging in a genocide. So we're looking at a political vacuum, we're looking at a moral vacuum, we are looking at really a kind of nihilism which is truly frightening. There are no rules anymore. You can commit the ultimate human atrocity, which is a genocide, and keep supporting it and crack down on people protesting against it. As you say, if you can do that, what else can you do? And
Right.
the list of things you are simply unable to do grows longer and longer. There is no way you can come up with institutions that can meet all these other challenges, whether it's climate change or AI. At this point, you are engaged in mass slaughter, and you've
Right.
devoted all your energies to supporting that and to squashing and crushing dissent. And also, at this point, in the case of Western Europe, uh, appeasing a sexual abuser in the White House who bullies you, and you basically make yourself available to him for more bullying. Look at the way NATO leaders, the Secretary General of the NATO,
Right.
behaved in recent weeks. The messages he sent to Trump, like a small time mafia boss. I mean,
Hmm.
really, Michael, what we are looking at is a collapse, um, greater on a different scale altogether than the one we witnessed in the 1930s, where yes, some countries
Hmm.
really went into this spiral of madness, but there were some
Right.
countries that did not follow them, and that ultimately, after very many long years, managed to recreate some semblance of order in the world.
For sure.
Today,
Yes.
we are looking at those very same countries destroying that order. And so this is what makes this a truly
Mhm.
unprecedented moment.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I remember talking to Iranians about this, and they were all against the regime, but they were just as worried, if not more, about the aggressions by Israel and the US and the sanctions and all that. And they looked at me with horror and said, can you tell me, like, if Israel attacks us and the United States attacked us, it was not now, it was like some years ago, but they said, if they attack us, if they make war against us, what are we going to do? We can't really defend ourselves against the US. Against Israel, maybe we have a chance, but against the US, there is no chance. And I think that
Yeah.
also makes it so dangerous. When the aggression comes from the most powerful country, the most powerful country should show global leadership. And sometimes in the past, to some degree, in some situations, it did that. Never as much as they pretend, but now it's gone.
Oh, it's. I mean, no, it's disastrous at so many levels. I mentioned the Secretary General of NATO. If you examine how he got the job, the things he had to do to get that job. If you look at the Dutch newspapers, I don't know whether it's been reported in the German press,
Hmm.
but as Prime Minister of the Netherlands, he was actively suppressing a report um, prepared by his own government of Israeli war crimes. He knew that that kind of report would endanger his chances of becoming NATO Secretary General, because obviously the Americans decide who's going to be the Secretary General of NATO. And at that point, he didn't want to antagonize the Biden administration. So this is a man who's now sucking up to Donald Trump. The things
Yeah.
he would do to hold on to his position. And I mean, I think this is how genocides happen. There are these very big complex theories about, how does something like the Holocaust happen. But the people who lived through it, people like Primo Levi,
Hmm.
in the end, what they said was the main reason was something as petty as career promotion, self advancement, fear of losing what you have, of not getting on the right ladder of social mobility. These are the things that make so many people collude in monstrous acts of violence. And I think that is really what we are looking at today. People interested in holding on to their jobs, to their positions of power, influence, in which they are making as much money as they can. Even Trump is doing that, while he's in the White House, he's minting money for some, state in the future, for some situation in the future where he will need that money and his family would need it. Likewise, everyone else is doing the same. So I think we moved very far away from responsible political leadership that maintains certain norms, certain rules, has some respect for basic decency. These are really, in many ways, completely amoral people running our countries. And I'm afraid, I'm sorry to say this, but many people in my own profession are following them very closely.
Hmm. And do you have any ideas about the root causes, like of this depressing picture of so much of the world really going downhill? Like, why is for some years now the world definitely becoming worse and worse? What is going on? Is the internet one of the reasons, like social media, or is it the global inequality that is getting worse and worse? What do you think are the reasons for this?
Well, there are many reasons, obviously. There's no one, kind of, but I think one factor that to me seems very prominent and yet is not much talked about or written about is the diminution, the decrease in our human capacity to feel compassion and empathy.
Hmm.
Um, I think, societies really, in a way, cannot work if they don't, if they're not built on, some ideas of the common good, some idea of
Right.
collective welfare. If you move away from those ideas and you think society really um, mostly consists of individuals competing with each other at every level, in their jobs and social media, on Instagram, then I think you're going to look at a comprehensive, uh, massive increase in selfishness,
Hmm.
in the kind of weakening of social bonds, in the weakening also of, ordinary moral constraints. And that is something that has happened quite rapidly over the last 2 or 3 decades. I'm old enough to remember growing up in India with some idea of, um, you know, some sense that we were all in it together, that rich or poor, we were all kind of part of a society that was dedicated to some very basic fundamental notions of justice, and equality. I no longer have that sense. I think what has happened in the meantime is a kind of global explosion of extreme hyper individualistic notions of existence. And that, in addition to all the things you mentioned, and social media obviously exacerbates those tendencies.
Hmm.
It makes people more makes people feel more isolated, makes them feel more uh, envious of other people's good fortune, makes them more competitive.
Hmm.
I think it doesn't really foster compassion and empathy. And I think those values have really gone sort of missing, and there are no political parties, no political movements which can bring back those values into the public sphere. So even the left, when it responds to the far right, it really only comes up with, kind of technocratic solutions. It doesn't really talk about community of feeling of belonging, of creating something together, of being in it together.
Right.
And I think it's what we're looking at today really is at least partly the triumph of the very kind of destructive triumph of a hyper individualistic culture.
Yeah, it seems it's also, I think there is hope when you look at opinion polls, both in the West and also many countries in the global South, that where a majority of the people are think that inequality is too high and should be done more to help the poor. And also the majority tends to be against the wars. And so there is actually, would be in principle, a lot of support for more left-wing politics.
Yes.
Yeah, but so the question is, why is the left failing? Why do we get the impression we have to choose between right-wing populists who want like some sort of 21st century fascism and a liberal establishment that shows its own extremism in Gaza, and the best they have to offer is like, yeah, I don't know, like neoliberalism sprinkled with a little bit of woke ideology or whatever. And so, what happened? Like, where is the left actually? What happened to it?
Well, I think, I mean, that's a large question, but I think definitely the left has been delegitimized in a way that makes it very difficult for it to even kind of speak about the things it used to speak about, especially after 1989, when socialism and even to a certain extent social democracy was kind of conflated with communism. And so the idea of a strong left presence in politics, in culture at large, started to fade. So I think, if we have an impoverished rhetoric today, it's because a lot of people who never really traditionally belonged to the left, but were mostly, or called themselves liberal, but were actually always on the right,
Hmm.
but still wanted to maintain a certain moral prestige for themselves. So they called themselves liberal. They couldn't really see themselves as conservatives or right wingers
Hmm.
for aesthetic reasons. So they call themselves liberals, and those people have been dominant. Those people, in a way, are to be held responsible for this state of inequality that the far right is now kind of exploiting. And I think the old left, the the people who used to speak about communities and movements and belonging together and create those kind of left wing cultures, not just political cultures but also journalistic cultures, literary cultures. You have to remember,
Hmm.
like, so many literary cultures in places like Britain and so on were almost entirely off the left.
Hmm.
And today, they're all atomized. We're all existing in, these little sort of, we all kind of set out little stalls in the marketplace of ideas and books. We're all selling our individual books. There's
Hmm.
really no community, nothing that brings us together. Uh, Occasionally, a letter will go around, asking you to sign this or that, some sort of protest against the genocide or something else. But that's really it. There are no left left literary, journalistic, intellectual cultures anymore. So I
Hmm.
think that kind of infrastructure has to be built up, um, and a lot of things have to happen before we can say yes. the left has a presence again in our public spheres, and that will require a lot of work. And at this point, there are such severe constraints on that culture. You might get arrested if you do certain things,
Yeah.
if you express a strong opinion in favor of Palestine. You might lose your job. um, so I think it's a very challenging environment for any person of the left, and let alone attempts to build an institution
Yeah, they
of the
tend to
kind that
paint a
we see.
picture of you being like a radical when you're just like left wing, and also like naive, like especially in Germany right now or in the US. If you just say like we should like tax the rich and give to the poor and we should end these wars, people just laugh at you as if you're like a naive idiot, like okay, a
Yeah,
nice hippie, And
yeah,
I often have to think about this beautiful song, What's So Funny About Peace, Love, and Understanding?
yeah,
Because I try to convince people and say there's nothing naive in standing up for world peace. We absolutely need it. We have no other choice. We need peace with China and with most, like, we need peace between the great powers and most of the other nations, the big nations, so that we can together fight climate change, fight poverty, regulate AI in a way so that AI benefits everyone instead of like killing us all. I mean, we have no choice. The alternative is constant warfare and at some point also nuclear war. So
And these are real scenarios that you're pointing to. I think the gravity of the situation should not be underestimated. No, I mean you saw very recent instance of this very promising left politician Zoran Mamdani being elected, and look at the way he's being
mm,
treated. And I'm not
yeah,
speaking here of the far right Republican racist
no,
politicians and media.
yeah,
He's being interviewed on mainstream channels, and he's talking about, doing good for grocery stores. And
yeah,
people are coming back and saying, talking about Soviet grocery stores. So he's
yeah,
being delegitimized as a Soviet agent, a communist. Like this is really, it's truly extraordinary. I mean, the way, as I said, people in journalism are behaving today is just really really shocking and makes you kind of question this whole fourth estate that is supposed to be a pillar of democracy, and today it's simply a mouthpiece for the rich and powerful. There's these massive kind of infrastructure of newspapers and journalism. This we are living through a really serious crisis here right now, Michael.
yeah. I think that the left in many countries, certainly in Germany and in the US, has made this big mistake in a cultural area. It's hard to put into words, but they don't understand that their lifestyle and the way they talk and the way they walk and the way they dress just doesn't appeal to most ordinary people. And they don't want to be ordinary. They most of them are so countercultural and rebel and woke and all that, which is fine. I'm not against it. I myself have like that music and so on. But you need to understand that you want to build communities, and for that, and people also are longing for a normal, regular life, with a house and a
Yeah,
car and a good life, and they want peace and stability and security, and I think the left really fucked this up. Like this is a
Yeah,
big part of the problem. People would really actually the basic left values of the more traditional left could really appeal to the masses all around the world, I think. And the reason why they don't is because people feel like, these people are just weird, like too weird, too radical, too naive.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it's
I
sad.
think there are just too many. There's just too many filters in place here.
Mhm.
Before you get even started, there are enough people saying, this is just too naive, this is too silly, and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. And so there is no encouragement. There's only discouragement coming to you from existing institutions. So I think you need, like I think
Zoran Mamdani would be really fascinating to watch if he is able to transcend the limitations of the culture that he's working in, the massive kind of campaign to delegitimize him. If he can survive all that, that would be very good news for the rest of the planet, because it'll show that there is still virtue, there is still some benefits to be gained from speaking of justice and dignity and community in the fashion, in the way he has been speaking of. And it's possible to disregard, it's possible to circumvent all the restrictions that the political class and the journalistic class put on you. I realize, Michael, I have to go now. Actually, I have to have a hard stop here because I have another meeting. But
Okay.
no, I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
I also really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Pankaj. I appreciate it. So,
Likewise. Likewise.
okay. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yep. I like that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Dieses Audio konnte nur entstehen, weil zahlreiche Leser und Leserinnen die Nachdenkseiten fördern und durch Spenden unterstützen. Wenn Sie auch etwas tun wollen, klicken Sie einfach den entsprechenden Button auf unserer Website an. Übrigens, Sie können uns auch bei iTunes, SoundCloud und YouTube hören und wenn Sie mögen, gerne unseren Kanal abonnieren und eine positive Bewertung für uns abgeben. Wir freuen uns über Ihre Unterstützung und die Weiterverbreitung unserer Inhalte.